Grace and peace, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening. Grace and
Grace
peace.
and peace.
We just welcome all of you this evening to our BTC Center's Healthy Living Series. This is a BTC Center, 501c3 Inc., a nonprofit organization. We're excited that you've joined us this evening as we present, as Dr. Forbes will present to us, someone who's very familiar to all of us, the talk on RSV and the value of prevention and lessons learned for your health. Let me introduce to you Dr. Forbes. Dr. Forbes is our speaker for this evening. Dr. Forbes is an accomplished pediatric researcher and chief academic officer at Akron Children's Hospital. Excuse me. Please forgive me as I'm trying to go through this. He's the chief academic officer at Akron Children's Hospital with a medical degree from the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. Dr. Forbes has dedicated his career to improving child health through discovery, teaching, service, and implementation science. Despite humble beginnings, Dr. Forbes' childhood experiences instilled him with remarkable resilience. He is also an ordained minister and has been married to Dr. Yolanda Moore Forbes for over 35 years, with whom he has 2 adult children. Let's please give a warm welcome to Dr. Forbes as he presents to us this evening on RSV. God bless you, Dr. Forbes, and welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome,
Thank you,
Doctor. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Pastor Lyde, for the invitation. Thank you, BTC, for another opportunity to share and learn. I'm going to go ahead, if that's okay, Denise, and get right at it.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to see if I could share my screen, if you'd let me there.
Give you. Are you able to share it?
No, not yet.
Pastor Lyde? We're trying to share Dr. Forbes' screen.
There you go. All righty, let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, terrific. So tonight, I'm going to go ahead for the next few minutes and talk about the value of prevention. And I'm going to use what we've been through over the past 3 years as an example of what is a huge, probably cultural communication gap. You can tell me at the end of this kind of what you think the problem really is.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk about RSV, the Triple-Demic that we talked about probably in the middle to late part of last year. We were all really concerned that we would end up dealing with RSV and the flu and COVID all at the same time. And really how I think we, in many respects, lost our way over the course of the past 3 years. But I'm here to really share my excitement about the future and the lessons that we've learned and how we can get ready for the next pandemic and, God willing, do better. So let's dive in. So RSV, flu, and COVID. I remember last summer there was this whole idea that RSV was coming, flu always comes, and of course COVID really never went away. And at the middle of last summer, there was a lot of concern that our already overwhelmed healthcare system would be absolutely devastated by this combination. And in some areas of the country, in fact, Uh, we had people waiting incredibly long hours. There was a lot of care delay. There was care failure. There was harm. There was death all across the United States to varying degrees. And so we're going to talk about what is RSV, what is flu, what is COVID, and why is it so important for us to understand their impact. But really, I'm using these three different viral infections in the context of a larger discussion about our responsibility to one another, and the need for a greater sense of trust in our culture.
Hey, I'm
So
on
let's
it.
talk. I'm sorry. Okay. So let's talk about RSV first. RSV, by the age of 2, we know that 95% of all children have already been infected with RSV. About half the people who get RSV will ultimately get symptoms. The other half will never, ever have symptoms, but they'll still be contagious, which is why all of the viruses we'll talk about tonight will outlive every single one of us. And that is all of these viruses, all the winter viruses. It's not as if they infect you, you get sick, and everyone knows that you're contagious. The fact is, for most of these, RSV is probably the most dramatic in this respect, where most people, half the people or so, 45%, who get infected will have some kind of symptom. The other reality is all of the clinical presentations, whether it's RSV, flu, COVID, all of those other viruses that we've heard about, some that most people have never heard about, like human metapneumovirus, of course, rhinovirus. All of these viruses look exactly the same. They start with a bit of a runny nose, cough, watery eyes, and as it moves into the lungs, you end up with much more lower respiratory symptoms. And for some people, particularly infants with significant chronic disease, the elderly, and elderly by definition in the United States now is anyone over the age, this is according to the CDC, not me, of 50 is considered elderly. And of course, the immune compromised. We are aware in many, many studies around the world that severe RSV is associated with long-term consequences, including what looks clinically like asthma. Flu, I think everyone is very familiar with the flu. RSV is very familiar. Every pediatrician worth their oats knows everything about RSV back and forth. We deal with it every single year. And for pediatricians, RSV is our flu. So if you look at preschool kids, even earlier, like kids, under the age of 2, flu is not a real big deal. Not that it never happens, but it's very unusual. RSV is much more of a big problem, rhinovirus much more of a problem. But in the adult world, and if you're dealing with adult illnesses, and certainly around the world, flu is a huge problem. We know that every single year it comes back, seasonal epidemics. It's an interesting kind of phenomenon. For those of you really interested in this stuff, you can read more about it online. But basically, this year, what happens during the summer in Australia, right, the other half of the world, flu migrates around the globe, and summer in Australia is our winter, and winter for us is their summer. And so during the summer, we learn from the people in the Southern Hemisphere what variants of influenza are there. And then our manufacturers here in the United States and Europe work pretty much for the rest of the year to get us ready for the winter season. And so that's how we predict what strains, whether it's type A or B or H1 or H1N5, whatever. And so we learn from that and create a brand new vaccine every year. Now, just like RSV, most patients with influenza never have symptoms. So you may have your friends or family will say, well, I don't get the vaccine and I've never had the flu. Well, it turns out about 80% of the people who get infected with influenza never, ever get symptoms, but they're contagious. And so by the time you start backing away from me because I'm coughing and sneezing, and my eyes are watering, it's too late. And so the only way you can really protect yourself from the flu in particular is vaccine. And of course, we've learned all of the other mitigation measures like wearing a mask, social distancing, avoiding crowds, et cetera. But if you want to reduce the transmission and impact in your community, probably one of the best things to do is to get vaccinated. And of course, that whole package works now that we know what to do for not just COVID, but for all of these viruses. The impact on public health is pretty devastating. Now, hospitalizations obviously are a big deal. Deaths are a big deal. And the vaccine, the best year, if you look at World Health Organization data, CDC data, influenza vaccine effectiveness ranges about 30 to 40, maybe 45% at best. That means that it reduces the amount of severe disease by about a third to maybe a half, which if you look at the big book of vaccines, it's not like the greatest vaccine of all time. All right, let's just be honest about it. But we know that if you're unvaccinated, your risk of hospitalization and death is much higher, even though the vaccine is not among the greatest vaccines of all time. It's very effective, and it's certainly better than nothing. So we know there are limitations and all of that, but again, being vaccinated against the common bug is smarter than not being vaccinated, frankly. So what more can we say about COVID-19? My goodness. I think more people learn how to pronounce coronavirus and messenger RNA than ever before. So, for those of us who survived the pandemic, that's a good thing. We're smarter than ever. We know a whole lot more about virology and epidemiology and statistics than we would have ever wanted to sign up for. And so we're a lot smarter as a culture, I think, in many ways. What do we know? So COVID-19 is the name of the disease associated with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And SARS stands for the Severe Adult Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2, which means there's a coronavirus 1. And there's a severe adult respiratory syndrome due to coronavirus that happened earlier. And there was. SARS-CoV-2, the original SARS, originated in China and really was mapped out pretty neatly epidemiologically, where there was an international cardiology conference, I believe, in China. And there were people there that basically took it back to their countries. And so we ended up with a global pandemic related to the first disseminated coronavirus. But there will be another pandemic, and it more than likely will be coronavirus. So if you look at from 2000 until here we are in 2023, we've had 5 major outbreaks. 2 of those have been pandemics. So we've had H1N1, we had Ebola, we had SARS-CoV, the original SARS, and then we had COVID-19. And so I'm pretty convinced that the next iteration of this, remember there was MERS as well, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which was another coronavirus. And so all of these outbreaks, 3 of the 5 major outbreaks have been coronavirus. Coronavirus is an RNA virus, as you all know now. And among RNA viruses, all RNA viruses are fairly unstable, which means they change a lot. So if you think you've figured it out and you make a vaccine, then suddenly it morphs and it turns into another version of itself. The unique thing, and this is an important teaching point, the unique thing about SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is that the human immune system, nowhere in the planet had ever seen it. And so not only was it particularly, we say, virulent, it had a lot of weaponry with it, and it was lethal when it infected people. One of the reasons it was so dangerous is because our immune system looked in the library of immune responses, and there was nothing there. And so SARS-CoV-2 pretty much had its way with whoever it infected. And if you were old, very young, immune compromised, it was much more likely to hospitalize you or even kill you. And so as we think about this, we knew how it emerged, we knew how it spread. And honestly, we can talk maybe in another context about what I think is one of the triumphs in human history when it comes to medicine and science and working together. Now, 3 years is a very long time. We lost a lot of people. Many of you on this call probably lost loved ones because in pandemics, everyone who survives has lost someone because it's a pandemic. It goes everywhere. But the story, I think, is worth sharing in that by the last week, the 52nd week of 2019, there was a publication out of China related to the Wuhan lab that talked about and shared the entire genome for the virus that causes COVID, that we now know is a virus that causes COVID. There were early warning signs going on in Wuhan that something horrible was happening. And you can read online, and many of you probably know there was suppression by the Chinese government. And then the researchers got the DNA, got the genome, the RNA, and they published it in the last week of 2019, which is why it's called COVID-19, because it was first really fully recognized in the final week of 2019. Well, by the second week or so of 2020, the first case in the United States happened. By then, we already realized that the horse is out of the barn, cat's out of the bag, however you want to say it, it's everywhere. I remember being naive in March or so of 2020 when Seattle Children's gave a webinar and talked about how incredibly devastating it was. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, it's terrible to be there. Thinking in my mind, well, it probably won't hit Ohio. Well, it would then hit New York City, devastated New York City. And many of us were thinking, wow, how did it go from Seattle to New York and kind of leapfrog the United States, right? Well, it didn't. We now figured out exactly how it happened. And it was clearly on its way to Ohio. And as many of you on this call know, it covered the entire United States. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm not aware of anyone I know who doesn't know someone or know of someone who died due to COVID-19. The transmission is just like RSV and flu. Sneezing, the symptoms are very similar, and then it turns into this severe mess. The impact on public health and healthcare systems, we'll be writing about this and talking about this for my grandkids to read about. This is really a spectacular event in human history. We know about variants, which are mutations at the genetic level. Clinically, we recognize them as variants. And again, RNA viruses are think of them as shapeshifters. That's pretty much what they do all the time. You may remember an old virus, not so old anymore. HIV is another RNA virus. We still don't have a vaccine for HIV. And the reason is HIV is even more wild in its morphing potential than coronavirus. And so you can have multiple variants of HIV in a single patient. That's how unstable the messenger RNA group of viruses are, and HIV is among the worst. COVID, we've kind of gotten ahead of it from a vaccine and natural immunity standpoint, so I'm grateful for that, but we know that we still have variants that are out there. And again, 2 degrees of separation. The aunt of a friend of mine went into the hospital for elective surgery, acquired COVID, and died after that surgery. So people are still dying due to COVID-19. Lots of management strategies are on the way and available to us, and I'm grateful for that. This looks like a super busy slide, but I really wanted to use this slide to give you kind of a rewind of what we just went through. And you're like, oh, why do we want to go backwards? I think it's really remarkable. A lot of these are economic indicators, so you can ignore the lines. What I really wanted you to notice were the bubbles, right? So December 31st, 2019, there's a new illness detected in Wuhan, China. This is a company, economics analysis company in Canada. So a lot of, these landmarks are Canadian landmarks. So Trump signs this historic $2.2 trillion stimulus bill right around here because we were in deep, deep trouble all around the world. The first case showed up in Canada in January, just like here in the United States. It was in Seattle, so I'm sure it was in Vancouver and California at the same time we discovered this gentleman in Seattle. The other thing I will point out that the Trump administration did that in retrospect was historic and brilliant, not just this $2.2 trillion stimulus bill, but the fact that he consigned 20 laboratories, pharmaceutical companies around the country to start working on a vaccine because we had the genome. The vaccine was next because he knew and his administration knew that no single company is going to immunize the whole world. So by charging all 20 companies to come up with a solution, he in fact really made a huge difference. And as you can see here, by December of 2021, The US announced a drop in its GDP. Inflation was completely out of control, but probably more than anything else, what happened in December of 2021? I'm sorry, a little bit too early there. December of 2020, less than a year after it was identified, the first vaccine was done in the United States with a 90% effectiveness. Really, absolutely unbelievable. And wherever you are on the spectrum, I will have to say that this is a miracle of modern medicine, that in less than 12 months, we were able to identify the genome, start clinical trials, test it all over the United States and around the world, and have a vaccine approved, albeit emergency approval, because the bug was so deadly. But within a year, you go from genome to a new vaccine. That is absolutely magnificent. And the reason many of us kind of don't even appreciate this is because of politics. And we'll get to politics in a moment. So vaccines are a solution. They have absolutely transformed public health and human history. If we go way back to the late 1700s, that's when the smallpox vaccine came out. Thank you, Edward Jenner. Really made a huge, huge difference there. Of course, the rabies vaccine and cholera vaccine in the late 80s. And in the early 1900s, things really took off. And by the mid 1900s, of course, the polio vaccine first discovered right there in Pittsburgh. I went to medical school at the University of Pittsburgh, and one of the places we went to was Salk Hall, named after Jonas Salk, and his colleague at Cincinnati Children's, Dr. Sabin, also created a polio vaccine, and again ended up almost eradicating that disease. When the H flu vaccine came out, Haemophilus influenza vaccine, this is a bacteria, not a virus. I started medical school and residency in the late 80s, and H flu was devastating for children in the first year of life. Horrible meningitis. The H flu vaccine made it so that I think I saw 1 or 2 cases of Haemophilus influenza type B meningitis during my entire residency. And so really a game changer there, and saved the lives of so many kids, in addition to preventing disability. And the list goes on and on. This is recorded, so you can always rewind it and read these. But hepatitis A, HPV, and Ebola vaccine, unbelievable that we're able to do the things that we're able to do. And of course, the COVID-19 vaccine that I like to say saved the world. But history matters. What you're looking at on your left is a lineup with, I think that's either Dr. Salk or Dr. Sabin, I actually can't remember. But this is how children responded to the polio vaccine in the 1950s, because they knew people who had polio. They knew that it paralyzed you. They knew that it could kill you. And so the vaccine was there, and it was people lined up to get the vaccine. And this is from 2020 in the Washington Post, beware the vaccine, where somehow we reached a point in our culture where vaccines are considered the problem and not the solution. And so we'll need to talk about that. So I want to know, like, how did we get there? And in light of this triple-demic that did happen, where does vaccine fit in, and how do we communicate the information better so that we can make better public health decisions? And I always like to say that public health is about private choices. So the more you understand, and the more your neighbors understand, and the more your zip code and your community and your county and your state understands, the better your overall health is going to be. So remember, key things here. The purpose of vaccines is to prevent severe disease. Vaccines are not designed to make sure you never catch a cold. Vaccines are there for diseases that can disable you or kill you or hospitalize you. That's the end point of getting vaccinated. So people say, well, I got the flu shot and I still got the flu. Were you hospitalized? Did you die? Did you end up in the ICU? Now, it can still happen, but it is exceptional to end up with severe disease after vaccine. It does happen. It's not perfect. There is no RSV vaccine, but as I hinted there, stay tuned because we're definitely working on it. Of course, there's an influenza vaccine. I told you that it works okay. It is not among the greatest of all time vaccines like COVID vaccine, but vaccination is still better than non-vaccination. And finally, COVID-19. It's the most effective pandemic vaccine in human history. That is not an exaggeration. That is a fact. Despite that, only about 60 to 70% of people actually took it, choosing rather to get natural immunity and take the gamble, where the vaccine will give you the benefits of natural immunity, that is, reduce hospitalization and death, but it will not give you what natural immunity can do to you. We're learning now, right? Long COVID, loss of smell, loss of taste, permanent loss of smell and taste, fatigue out the wazoo that just doesn't respond to anything. Those things do not happen as you're dealing with the vaccine. If you get natural immunity, you'll certainly get natural immunity. But at a time when it was killing people at a record rate, it really was a foolhardy decision, but I certainly understand why people did that. In the end, though, we end up with millions of people, including some of your loved ones and my loved ones, who died. My brother died from COVID. I'll go ahead and put that out there. Before the vaccine was developed. It was April of 2020. But after December of 2020, really the vaccine was available, and frankly, it really was a much better decision to get vaccinated than not. So why, when we are thirsty, would we choose to die of thirst? Here's a graphic on your right that asks, how effective are the COVID-19 vaccine candidates? This was around November-ish of 2020, before, of course, mid-December, when it was finally approved by the FDA. But you can see there the Moderna vaccine is 95% effective. The Pfizer vaccine was 95% effective. The Sputnik 5, which is the Russian vaccine, was 92% effective. So we really were doing a really good job with very, very effective vaccines with encouraging evidence during the trials. There's a reference on here, which is, again, one of the key articles that teaches you a whole lot more about variants and how the vaccines are kind of chasing the variants. The good news is, with all the vaccines, despite the variants, because of vaccine and natural immunity, we're able to tamp down the effect of a lot of those variants. And so I think we're in a much better space in April of 2023, certainly than we were in April of 2020. So thank God for that. But how did we get here? Let's go back to high school. I don't even know if we teach civics anymore, but I think it's important to review the social contract. What is that? Well, a social contract is this imaginary, I'll say, philosophical concept that the government is responsible for basic services, police and fire protection, military protection, a fair and established justice system, and of course, social welfare, right? For me as a citizen, the populace, our responsibility is actually to one another, right? We pay taxes, the government is due taxes, so they can fulfill their half, if you may, of the social contract. And in turn, we get police and fire protection and rail systems and all of those things that serve us. And we have a duty as well to engage in civic activities like voting and those types of things. So that's the nature of the social contract. And the social contract has as its premise that we actually need one another. The good news is I think most of us actually believe in the social contract. But a chain's only as strong as its weakest link. And if you're in a community where people don't believe in a social contract, there are absolutely going to be consequences. So what are some barriers to scientific communication? There are 4 on here. There are probably more, because I remain mystified, and this is what this talk is all about. How do we get through a pandemic with next generation scientific discoveries happening every single week? And yet we have a population of people who look at it and are skeptical. When you hear that a vaccine is 95% likely to prevent hospitalization and death, and people remain skeptical, unbelievable, right? Well, it's partly our fault. When I say our, I mean us as scientists, us in healthcare. We use a lot of jargon, a lot of abbreviations. There's the internet now, right? Not everything you believe on the internet is true, right? Not everything you read on the internet is true. So there's misinformation and there are seeds of distrust. Science is also complex. I'm a pediatric ICU doctor, right? I can't tell
It's 19 hours.
a pediatric immunologist what to do or how to do their job because I don't know pediatric immunology like they do, okay? So it keeps you humble as well. And the fourth barrier to scientific communication, I think, is just being human. I'll tell you what I mean. So here's the problem, right? I'll take this. This is an example of what may be in one of your charts as a patient. So here's a 54-year-old BM with AF who presents to the ED with SOB for 12 hours. There's a typo there. The chest CT is negative for PE, started on HFNCO2 without improvement, so will be admitted to acute care for further evaluation and management. I challenge this audience to make sense of what I just read. That is absolute jargon, right? Now, ER doctors will immediately understand, ICU doctors will immediately understand exactly what that problem is. And I would dare say most doctors and nurses who work, in the hospital will be clear on what this means. But this is about the patient. So shouldn't the patient understand this? And I would say yes. So I would encourage this audience to challenge your healthcare providers to use plain language. If you don't understand it, please don't just nod your head. I've done it myself, even as a doctor, because I just want to get out of there. But please ask them to use plain language. Do not use abbreviations. Do not use acronyms. Do not get excessively technical. Please avoid jargon. It does not help us when it comes to communication and trust. There are also seeds of distrust. Remember early in the pandemic, the White House, the CDC, Dr. Fauci made a statement that masks are unnecessary. Remember that? Within the hospital, you probably didn't feel this as much as we did in the hospital and in the ICU. We had a debate about whether or not coronavirus was airborne or not. We were always taught, and it's still true, that tuberculosis is airborne. What does that mean? That means that if I have TB and I walk into your house and I cough into your living room and leave, and you walk into that living room, you can pick up TB because it's still floating in the air. Okay? Most of us have never thought of winter viruses like RSV, flu, COVID, rhino as airborne viruses, but there was a fair amount of science that said it can be transmitted as an airborne particle. And so we had that debate internally. The mask was a very public debate. And a lot of the rationale then was that we didn't have enough masks. And so instead of having people burn them up wearing masks while they're walking down the street, we wanted to make sure that the healthcare system had enough masks. So there's a rationale behind that, but it really led to a lot of distrust early in the pandemic. And ultimately, I think led to people dying, to be honest. So how do we deal with this? We have to acknowledge misconceptions. We have to acknowledge the evolution of knowledge. When we in the ICU are debating whether or not coronavirus is airborne or not airborne, it's not because some of us are bad and some of us are good and some of us are smart and some of us are stupid. It's because science questions things, and asking questions is how we get to the right answer. And if we look as if we're changing our minds, it's because better evidence has been presented, has been vetted, and has now been accepted as better evidence. Not because we're wishy-washy, but because we're in a relentless pursuit of data that best approximates reality. That's what we do in science. And so, yeah, we are allowed to change our minds as long as the evidence supports it. And the public isn't ready for that. And so there's seeds of distrust. We have to clarify the definition of differences when we talk about facts. In science and in scientific theory, we talk about a hypothesis. We talk about proof. We talk about evidence. And very rarely do we, in fact, talk about facts. Because in science, almost everything is questionable. Like you can ask a question of anything. And so we're asking questions today, is rhinovirus airborne? I mean, we've never done the studies on it. We just assumed it was not. So now people are asking the question, is rhinovirus airborne? Is influenza airborne, right? We're asking all of these questions now. So you may see data that says you need to wear a mask all the time when you're around flu because it's airborne for other reasons. We used to think of it as droplet. So all of these things can become very confusing. And so what we do as scientists and as physicians is we simply trust the evidence. We vet it for ourselves, we debate it among ourselves, and we make the best decision in light of the current evidence. And it may be a different decision than a year ago because there's better evidence. Finally, we want to provide clear, evidence-based explanations. Now, none of that is necessarily what you're going to find on Twitter, right? Because in this day and age, it's so easy to tell a story and get likes and sway public opinion, whether it's true or not. In fact, it doesn't have to be true at all, but you can tell a story. As scientists, we don't trust stories. We trust science, and we trust the scientific method and the scientific process. And so hearing that something works for COVID, for example, vitamin C or thiamine or whatever, we're going to test it. We're going to ask questions about it. We're going to poke holes in it. And if it doesn't work, like hydroxychloroquine, just doesn't work. I mean, we tried really, 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 really hard to make sure it worked because we wanted something that worked, and it just didn't work. And so it's very important, I think, to recognize where the seeds of distrust come from. Some of it certainly comes from us. But the other part, frankly, is that science is complicated. Having said that, it's not hard. And what do I mean by that? I remember sitting in my calculus class, one of my hardest classes, and I would say to myself, this is so complicated, it's so hard. And then it dawned on me, if he can teach me, I can learn it, right? That's what TAs are for. And so I would read my books and I would pray like crazy. And I would hope, and I would reach out to my TAs and my professors and say, teach me. And so it is complicated, but it's not hard. You have to put in the time to learn it. And ultimately, you have to kind of trust your experts. So when we talk about coronavirus, paramyxoviruses, variants, messenger RNA, the fact is most people don't remember that stuff from high school. But some of us liked it in high school, and we've studied it for the rest of our lives. And so, yeah, it's a different perspective on this thing. So we have to know our audience. We have to speak their language, and using analogies, creating context, visual aids, really trying to help people understand this science because it really and truly matters. Finally, it's just being human, to distrust and ask questions and frankly, to be defiant, right? I'm convinced that many people did not get the vaccine because frankly, no one's ever been able to control them, and no one's going to start controlling them, especially about some stupid vaccine. And that's them, right? That's their personal bias. It's their culture, their religious upbringing, their emotional upbringing, whatever trauma they've endured, they will not be had, right? So they're going to stay skeptical. So be aware of those biases. And the way we deal with that in healthcare, we try to at least, is just be transparent, honest answers. Someone may say to me, doctor, what is this? And if I don't know, I say, you know what? I don't know. And I go get help. Right. So I'm not expected to know everything just because I'm a doctor. Right. But I know other people who are smarter than I am in that area who can help everybody to come to a better condition. And finally, let's not forget the impact of science. So what's next? Inside the hospital, we like to say, be ready, don't get ready. Right. So there are hospitals around the country who are doing active shooter drills not because we obsess over that stuff, but we know that it's not if anymore, it's when. It's just so common that people are doing this. There will be another pandemic, as I mentioned before. 3 of the 5 outbreaks since 2000 have been coronavirus. It's very unstable. Influenza virus, very unstable. There will be another pandemic. So be ready, don't get ready. Finally, and get educated as well. And finally, remember our social contract. I'm going to just put this out there. We absolutely cannot survive without one another. And anyone who believes otherwise is really deceived themselves. We need one another in a major way in order to get through all of these things, all of the cares of this life and all of the headaches and heartaches. We need one another. So please remember our social contract and take care of one another. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Forbes.
Sure.
Very informative discussion. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Forbes, I would encourage you to please type it in the chat, and Dr. Forbes will answer that question accordingly. Again, please type it in the chat. Thank you. Again, we appreciate you being here with us, Dr. Forbes. I want to introduce our Executive Director, Dr. Monica Forbes, who's on with us this evening. And also our chairperson of the BTC Center, Jane Nicholson. And it looks like from Jane Nicholson, there is a question. She said, what are your thoughts on many theaters' performances and churches moving to optional mask wearing?
Yeah, that's a great question. We try to follow the evidence. And so depending on the rate of COVID in your area, you may have a low enough rate of COVID in the area, a high enough rate of vaccine immunity and natural immunity, the transmission is very low. And so the decision to get rid of the mask is usually based on that type of surveillance and that type of evidence. And at least the church leaders that I've spoken to and participated with, they're very, very deliberate and intentional about this. This is not, I'm tired of a mask, let's get rid of the mask. They're really paying attention to the data and they want their folks to be safe. There are downsides of wearing a mask when you don't need to. We need to see each other's faces, right? I think we've learned that. So if you don't need to wear the mask, you don't need to wear the mask. And so if your COVID prevalence rate in the community is low and you have a high vaccine and natural immunity, which many of us assume is pretty high these days, then you don't have to wear a mask. And I think requiring it of everyone, we can really step back from that. At the same time, if you're immune compromised and you know who you are and you know who your loved ones are, if you're among the elderly and you're not quite sure, I mean, you can wear your mask as long as you want to.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Dr. Forbes. If you are immunocompromised and you've received what is known as the monoclonal antibodies, should you still get a COVID vaccination in addition to that? And if you have, and this is like a two-part question, if your B cells have been depleted and then you find out that the monoclonal antibodies aren't working, should you again receive the COVID vaccination and other vaccines?
Yeah, that's a great question. Complicated question. So the first part of that is if you have received a monoclonal antibody as treatment for COVID, should you still get the vaccine? And the recommendation currently is yes. You need to wait. I think the last CDC guidance I saw was 90 days after you get the infusion to get the vaccine. What we've seen with respect to people who get vaccines after monoclonal or even after COVID is there is a boost, and the way the immune system works is you generate your own antibodies that in fact may protect you against future variants. And so the benefit of the vaccine, because it's been proven to be incredibly safe, is that even after a natural infection, getting the vaccine boosts you even more. And so if you've been infected and you've been treated with monoclonal, you can wait. I'm trying to remember the latest guidance. I think it's 90 days. It may be a month because we've gone back and forth on it. But once that period is over, you can get your vaccine. And again, it just broadens your immunity. The question about B cell depletion is a really important one because B cell immunity is very important as part of your adaptive immunity, how you're going to respond to future infection. Again, I think the recommendation would still be to get the vaccine, primarily because of its safety profile. And if your B cells are depleted, you're immune compromised. And so you may still be able to process the vaccine and generate better than nothing. It's almost like the flu vaccine rationale, right? It's not going to be as great as if you had a fully constituted with B cells, but it's certainly going to be better than not having it at all.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Dr. Forbes, if you could talk a little bit about the benefit of those who did get the vaccine for those who did not get the vaccine?
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest benefit was reduced hospitalization and death. in the short term. The longer term benefits is that the risk of long COVID, the fatigue, myocarditis, all of the natural consequences of natural immunity and natural infection, you don't get those with the vaccine. Could you get, 1 out of 10 million people may get, some of these side effects or from the vaccine? Maybe. But we've delivered, the last count I saw was about 15 billion doses of the first two versions of the COVID vaccine. And the safety profile is unbelievable. Now, some people still don't believe that. I don't think I'm going to ever convince them of that. But I think the facts I could speak are the facts. And with multiple billions of doses and very, very, very rare complications, I think it would be foolhardy to not get the vaccine at this point, or not think about it in a positive way. So I think the long-term downsides of natural infection is what we were all trying to avoid at the beginning of the pandemic. Early on, it was hospitalization and death. For some people, it's still hospitalization and death. But today, it would be prudent to still get the first two vaccines. So if a child is born in 2023, as soon as they're eligible, I would still make sure they get the COVID vaccine because it's still out there and they're still at risk. And if they get natural COVID, again, the chances of them getting some horrible outcome with natural COVID and natural immunity are actually low. But again, you don't want to be that parent that knew you could have prevented it. I hope I answered your question. Okay.
Any? My apologies. I have another question. I was trying to keep my little four-legged fur balls from making noise. This question is, I recently had a very bad head cold. I had not had a cold in 3 years. I am COVID ×4 and flu vaccinated. I think that was just a comment.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's awesome.
Yeah, how can that be? Yeah, great
And the
question.
question is thoughts.
I'll kind of dive into this because this happens a lot. If we were to, if I could show you, so we have tests for all of these different viruses. We test for about 19 different viruses and I think 6 or 7 different bacteria and other types of parasites when you have cold symptoms. The one virus that really has never changed in how frequently we're seeing it is rhinovirus. Rhinovirus accounts for about 25 to 35% of all of the cold symptoms that are still out there. So COVID, of course, at one point was like, 70% of all of the positives. COVID today in Akron, Ohio, is roughly about 6 to 7% of all the positives. And rhinovirus is 28% of the positives. So you can be vaccinated against flu, COVID, and there is no rhinovirus vaccine. You may say, why is there no rhinovirus vaccine? It doesn't kill or disable most people. That's why, honestly. It's very common, and so we'll still get colds from rhinovirus. So.
Another question.
Sure.
What do we think are the next steps for COVID? Do we think we are done as we experienced in 2020?
I don't think we're done with COVID. I mean, COVID is now one of the, before COVID, we used to talk about the usual suspects that show up every winter: RSV, flu, human metapneumovirus, rhinovirus, coronavirus. We now say OG coronavirus to make it different from COVID. And so what's the future? I think the future is going to be more versions of coronavirus, more versions of SARS-CoV-2. And as I mentioned, I think within the next decade, we'll probably have another pandemic. I don't think that's unreasonable to expect that. I think we should plan for that and expect that. I want to believe we're going to respond better this time, but I don't know. Um, and so I think the next step, we've learned a lot. We know how to mitigate. We know how to prevent it. If there's no vaccine, we still know how to protect one another, through social distancing and masking and hand washing and all that. So I think we're in a better position for the next one, and there certainly will be more problems coming down the pipe.
Thank you. We have another question from a participant. As long as I've lived and talking to my elders as well, the Spanish flu, diphtheria, rubella, polio, and all of the other known diseases have never, mutated and spread as fast as, screen is moving a little slow, excuse me. If someone else can see that and read it, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, here I have it. COVID is the fastest mutating virus ever known. How did this virus mutate and spread so quickly is the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a feature of coronavirus. Okay, I can't emphasize that enough. I think it's hard for people to understand this, but people who study coronavirus do it for a reason. Honestly, what's more rapidly mutating is HIV. HIV mutates way faster than coronavirus, but we have medication for HIV now, right? It took us a long time, but we now have medication, but there's no vaccine because it mutates so quickly. So COVID does and did mutate very quickly. At this point, though, 3 years later, we have enough natural immunity. We have enough protection in the community that it's certainly not as deadly as it used to be. But can it mutate again and become another deadly version of itself? Yes, absolutely. So I just think we have to be ready.
There was actually two parts to that question. And the other part is, did we ever find out the origin of the disease yet?
Yeah,
and
great.
The participant is saying right now, they're having a hard time buying into the theory of a bat or a reptile experiment in a lab in Wuhan.
Yeah, that's a great question. You mentioned, or one of your participants mentioned the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu was influenza recognized during the war in Spain. But the backstory of the Spanish flu is important. We called it the Spanish flu because it was first described by the Spaniards, right, in soldiers. But it was actually from an American troop from Indiana that brought it to Spain during the war. So and we've learned that, 50 years later. As far as the Wuhan theories and all that stuff, I will tell you my own personal opinion because you've asked me the question. And this sounds blunt, but I don't care. For me, at this point, what's more important is that we learn how to mitigate. And you can say, well, if it started in the Wuhan lab, then somebody's got to pay. I guess so. But I'm not going to be the one to make them pay. So what I'm focused on is, what are we going to do now? How do we move forward with this? And frankly, when there are solutions, let's make sure everybody gets the solutions. I don't want people folding their hands and saying, I'm not going to take this vaccine because I don't trust, when the scientific community is saying, not the government, the scientific community is saying it is 95% effective. We saw that, and we saw people die. And I think that's terrible, and people even spun religion into their personal beliefs. God is going to protect me. And then they got sick and died because there are natural things in the world, right? I mean, we wear our seatbelts, we wear helmets when we ride motorcycles, if we have motorcycles, right? Some of us on this call own firearms, right? So you can say God will protect you, and then you get kind of squishy about it. The science is the science. And again, I don't know where it started. But at this point, I think we have to just get ready for the next wave, frankly.
Absolutely. Another question, Dr. Forbes, does the vaccine causes strokes in some people?
Yes, some versions of the vaccines were associated with cerebrovascular accidents or thrombus in the brain. The one that was most notable for that was the AstraZeneca version of the vaccine, which is why I think most of the United States, we didn't see much AZ vaccine. Very common in New Zealand, very common in Australia, and they have a different problem there. Just to kind of vary a little bit from the question, in New Zealand and in Australia, they actually locked down the whole state. And not lockdown like we did here in the US, real lockdown. Like you couldn't go from Ohio to Pennsylvania. That's how they did it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they did it for a very long time with devastating social consequences. But what that did is there was not, and they locked it for visitors as well. You couldn't travel there. So there was no COVID, which meant there was also no natural immunity. And the government purchased AstraZeneca vaccine. So when they started vaccinating, people started getting strokes. So vaccine uptake was low because the disease is not that common because they were on lockdown, and people who got the disease were getting strokes, so they stopped. So that's kind of the Australian, New Zealand experience with this, very different from ours. We use Moderna and Pfizer, and I think, you know, we made the right call in retrospect. I mean, everyone was gambling, you know, no one knew, there's no playbook for this thing. So I think we were fortunate to have Pfizer and Moderna because the risk of thrombus strokes with Pfizer and Moderna is vanishingly small compared to the AstraZeneca version. Unfortunately, the AstraZeneca story turned into the COVID vaccine story. Do you know what I mean? There was no distinction made. We didn't choose the AZ vaccine. We, the United States, and the scientific community here in the United States didn't choose AstraZeneca because the effectiveness was not as high. You may remember that slide where Pfizer and Moderna was 95% effective and AstraZeneca was 72% effective. And so we felt that that 20% made a difference, and we went with Pfizer and Moderna. It also had less clots. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before we close out the questions? Yes, here's a question for you, Dr. Forbes. How can we tell the difference between COVID vaccines and people's overall health-related heart disease and strokes?
I'm not sure I understand the question. COVID vaccine and overall health. Can you ask the person to unmute maybe and ask it?
The question is, how can we tell what is the source?
Like if someone has strokes or heart disease, how can you tell if it's the vaccine or not?
Right. How can you tell whether it's COVID vaccine or just the person?
Oh, yeah. That's a really good question, because there's part of the movement around the vaccine confusion is this died suddenly movement. I don't know if anyone's familiar with died suddenly. A lot of the AstraZeneca data, as I mentioned earlier, where the vaccine is associated with more strokes, became the blanket statement for all COVID vaccines, when in fact, Pfizer, Moderna, that's really not a problem with it. It's the AZ vaccine. Anyway, the died suddenly movement took this information and turned it into a story. And people believe stories, whether they're true or not. And so there's this idea that when people die suddenly, it's probably because they had the COVID vaccine, any COVID vaccine. And so how do you combat that? I don't know. But to your question, how can you tell whether or not someone's heart disease or stroke is related to the vaccine? There's a number of ways. The first way is during the clinical trial itself, everything that happens to patients in a clinical trial gets reported. And the control group, the group that didn't get the vaccine, plus the group that did get the vaccine, you look at everything. Whether they get a fever, whether they get diarrhea, whether they get headaches, all that stuff gets reported. And we statistically analyze if it's more likely in the vaccine group or in the control group. And looking at all of the things that we looked at, people look at things like anxiety. I mean, honestly, is it vaccine related or not vaccine related? And so all of that is in the package insert for all of the vaccines. And it was found that there was no difference between the placebo group and the control group in the rate of most of those things. If you look at the AstraZeneca package insert,
It's 1930.
if you look at the AZ package insert, clots, thrombus, strokes are more common in the vaccine group than in the placebo group. Not so with Moderna and Pfizer. And so we can tell during the vaccine trial period. And then after the vaccine trial period, we go into what's called phase 4, where we continue to monitor everyone who gets the vaccine and whatever happens to them. Not to the degree like the clinical trial, where we monitored like their temperature every day. It's not like that. But if someone has a stroke, if someone has a heart attack, myocarditis, falls off a ladder, I mean, honestly, all-cause death is what we call that. We look at that. And to date, there's been zero relationship between the vaccine and these events that would have occurred naturally, right? So if you're 87 years old and you get the COVID vaccine, you get a stroke, we can say, because we've given billions of doses to billions of people, that the likelihood of having a stroke in this patient group is no higher than would have been expected without the vaccine. So we've statistically done that analysis, and multiple times have done that analysis, and really have not been able to see that relationship. Let's face it, scientists like fighting. And so when someone says the vaccine's totally safe, there's a bunch of us who are going to go, not so fast, prove it to me. And so that's science. And so we're continuing to look for all of those. Those are all legitimate questions. And so we're asking all of those questions. And the momentum of the data is, to date, there's no relationship between the two so far, except with the AstraZeneca vaccine. We did find that.
Thank you. Dr. Forbes, I have 2 more questions for you.
Okay.
First one is, how long does the vaccine stay in our body?
I'm going to be a little facetious when I say this, because this question comes up a lot. It lasts about as long as a can of beer. So when people say, what are the long-term effects of the vaccine? The way the vaccine works is about 2 to 3 days. So it goes into your body, your immune system sees it, and then your immune system disposes of it. It doesn't sit in your body for the rest of your life. The purpose of the vaccine is to give your immune system a photo, a snapshot, so that they can store it in its record. So the next time it sees it, you won't get sick. That's the purpose of the vaccine. So when people say long-term effects of vaccines, it usually means that they don't understand how vaccines work. There are no long-term effects of any vaccines. If vaccines are going to cause harm, they're going to cause harm within weeks to maybe months. Okay. But typically days to weeks, honestly. Mm-hmm. And believe me, we've looked a lot. So there are, for this vaccine and many others, long-term effects, it just doesn't work like that. So if you're worried about that can of beer that you drank on Friday affecting you 2 years from now, that's up to you. But it really doesn't work like that.
Right. Okay, here's our next question, our final question. Do you recommend adults have other vaccines as a regular preventive health measure? Examples: shingles vaccine, updated tetanus shots, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So the easy answer to that is yes. The longer answer to that is the purpose of vaccines is to prevent disability and death and hospitalizations. So it's up to you, right? It's like Billy Graham was telling a story about his dad. And he said his dad would say to him, he would say to his dad, "Dad, why do I have to brush my teeth?" He said, "You don't have to brush your teeth, only the ones you want to keep." Okay. And so when it comes to these vaccines, you only need to get the shingles vaccine if you don't want shingles. If you want to gamble and get shingles, or get tetanus, or any of these other vaccine preventable illnesses as an adult, missing work, missing time with your family, laid up in the hospital, ending up in a nursing home, or dying, I mean, that's what you're preventing. You're not preventing annoying diseases that prevent you from watching Netflix. You're trying to prevent life-changing illnesses. So again, public health, private choices, but you've got to understand what you're doing. The harm from the vaccine is minimal. The benefit is huge. And boy, if you end up getting tetanus as a 50-year-old, you're going to wish you had the vaccine. Wow. Trust and believe.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Dr. Forbes. Our participants are very pleased with what you've said thus far. They're saying, wow, great information. Thank you. Thank you for answering those questions. And this last participant, thank you. My provider gave me a list, and she had gotten a bit overwhelmed with all of the, I can identify
me too.
with that, I know.
I totally agree. There are
Yes.
so many vaccines. It's like, oh my goodness, but they're there for a reason, you know.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, and they can be given with the COVID vaccine. I mean, it's again, this has all been studied, and these are evidence-based recommendations. But it is a lot. It is overwhelming. I will tell you again, telling you a story. Right, this isn't science, but this actually happened years and years ago. I took care of a baby who ended up with the flu. He was about 9 months old, should have had the flu shot at 6 months, and ended up getting really, really bad flu and ended up on ECMO and almost died. And his dad said to me, you know, there were so many vaccines when he went to the pediatrician. I said, you can give him everything, but let's get the flu shot next month. And in that time period, he ended up with the flu. So, you know, it is a lot, but it's been tested, it's validated, it's evidence-based. And I would just say in conclusion, it's worth it. It really is.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
Sure. Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks for
you
your
for
time.
your time. Thank you so much. I have another question personally, but I'll ask it another time.
Okay.
I mean,
Anytime.
we're going to get you back here again, sir.
Of course, of course.
Thank you.
Yep.
Does anyone, well, I would first ask our pastor, Pastor Lyde, if there's anything further that you would like to say, or Pastor Jackie. Oh, and also we have with us Dr. Forbes from our BTC board. We have our executive director, Dr. Monica Reese is on, and we have our chairperson, Jane Nicholson, as well as some of our other board members, Janet Ward. I believe there's, I see other few names out there, Wallace, Deidre Thompson, but I thank all of you for your participation. Dr. Reese, is there something you would like to say?
Yes, thank you so much, Reverend Denise. I just want to thank Dr. Forbes so very much. I don't think we can say thank you enough, because one of the things that I was thinking is that because of the education that you have provided us and the guidance, I think, at least I'll speak for me, as we navigated the 3-year-long COVID pandemic process, I felt much more informed, much more assured, because you provided such excellent information. And it also, you taught us what we should be asking our own providers, what we should be doing, how we should be assisting our own family members and others that we come into contact with. So I can't thank you enough for all the fabulous education that you have given us, the time you have given us. You know, we know that you're a very busy man, and you have just been so generous to give us your time and all the work you've done and all the various topics you've covered. So I just, that's all. I just want to thank you very much on behalf of the BTC Center, on behalf of Baptist Temple, on behalf of all of us. I'm sure others may want to say something, but I just wanted to tell you personally, I feel like I've learned so much. I even have incorporated some of the gems of knowledge you gave in my work, because I do clinical work in mental health. And there's so many myths out there, so many misconceptions. And I was able, based on, and you'll probably chuckle with this, I said, there's a renowned expert that I have heard lecture, and he has given, and what you're saying is not based in fact. And this is what is true. And I just felt like I could do that because you gave us such very excellent.
Wow, that's glad to hear that. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Jane?
Thank you. I like to echo what Monica Reese has stated. It's been a wonderful event in the history of Baptist Temple Church and BTC Center to find Dr. Michael Forbes and have him partner with us. His willingness to be available to us and his willingness to share honestly on what we're being confronted with. So thank you, Dr. Forbes. I'd like to thank Reverend Denise Walker, who coordinates these sessions, spends a lot of time planning and facilitating. And we thank you. You are also a wonderful find for BTC Center.
Thank you.
And lastly, I'd like to thank all the participants who have joined us on all of these sessions, particularly this evening. Keep on the lookout for other sessions. And I also like to also thank Reverend Rodney Lyde, who is on the board of BTC Center, but who has always been willing to support the center by collaborating between the center and the church. So we thank you for being open to those collaborations. And I would like to just let you say the final thank you remarks, Reverend Lyde.
Well, Dr. Forbes, what else can be said? It's all been said very well, but the only thing I'll add, thank you to my Brooklyn brother. Okay. So it should be said, the Akron, the Pittsburgh, and all the.
That's true. I didn't say Brooklyn.
That's a brother from Brooklyn too. So no, thank you so much, Dr. Forbes, and
thank you, sir.
To Reverend Walker, to Dr. Reese, to the board of BTC, and to all of our participants. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a lot. If you guys don't mind, I just want to say some of the comments that are in the in the chat. It's good stuff, Dr. Forbes. They appreciate you. Someone says, please keep coming back. Okay. So thank you again. Thanks for everything. God bless you. God bless everyone. Thanks again for joining us this evening. God bless you, Pastor Lyde and the board. Thank you so much for allowing us this opportunity. God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
See you, Mike.
night.
Good night.
Right.